I know every time being a minister myself, you bring up something like that, which really is challenging a very widespread accepted social norm, you get pushback and you have to go into it knowing you're likely going to lose some congregants. Because if it's a really widely accepted social norm, you've hit a hot button. Even no matter how soft you try to peddle it or present it, it's kind of knowing that you're going to upset some people, and some people may even leave.
As a vegan, do you ever feel like you're living in a parallel universe, aware of things that many others don't even seem to notice, let alone acknowledge? I'm Chrissy Benson, host of the Vegan Posse podcast. We talk with vegans from around the globe who, like you, are living lives of integrity and compassion with an eye toward justice. Through their personal stories, you'll come to see that you're not an outlier. In fact, you're part of an entire posse of individuals who aren't just keeping the peace, they're creating it through their food choices and beyond. You won't be saddling up, but you're in for the ride of your life. Welcome to the Vegan Posse. Hey, Posse. I'm Chrissy Benson, host of the Vegan Posse podcast. I've got some exciting announcements to share. First, we vegans are very good at caring about lots of animals, but sometimes we neglect ourselves. For this reason, we've got a special self-love series coming up. A special series of episodes dedicated to expanding our tenderness, affection, curiosity, and sheer delight in one very important animal, ourselves. There will be 8 episodes in total, released daily beginning Sunday, June 30th. Guests include Dr. Jen Hawk, Dr. Doug Lyle, and self-helpless host Delaney Fisher. And as preparatory reading, make sure to pick up a copy of my novel, Marrying Myself, which has been dubbed the anti-romance romance for its revolutionary self-love message. It's also got a vegan protagonist and was featured in Veg News magazine as a top media pick of the year in 2023. It's available on Amazon and everywhere else, or check out my website, ChristineMelanieBenson.com, where you'll also find a Marrying Myself playlist. The second big announcement is that I will be speaking at Vegan Summerfest this July in Johnstown, Pennsylvania. Vegan Summerfest is the longest running vegan conference in the U.S., and this year marks its 50th anniversary. Come join me for an amazing 5 days of speakers and the most delicious and super healthy vegan food you've ever stuffed your face with. We'll include the registration links in the show notes. And now for today's episode. As most of you know, I myself am a spiritual heathen, but I've always been a seeker and love having deep conversations about the bigger questions in life. Well, a few weeks ago, I met the Reverend Shad Goverland at a vegan gathering outside Kansas City. He's definitely someone who will go deep. I was so impressed with Shad's commitment to living in integrity, speaking out for animals, and really seeking truth. I came to find out that he was president and CEO of Unity Church, and he's also the brother of television producer Del Bigtree. The week after I met him, Shad stepped down as CEO of Unity, perhaps in part because, like a lot of other boundary-pushing spiritual leaders, some people maybe weren't quite ready for his message. But I have a feeling you all will be. So enjoy this conversation with Shad Goverland. Shad, welcome to the Vegan Posse. Are you ready for the ride of your life?
I guess I am.
You guess. That's fair.
I'm on the train.
Great. So I met you in person a few weeks ago at a vegan gathering in Kansas, but I first saw you when you and some of your family members were featured on an episode of an independent media show that some of our listeners may be familiar with called The Highwire, hosted by your brother Del Bigtree. So first of all, just a background question. How did you and Del Bigtree, who is your brother, end up with different last names?
I thought you were going to say, how did we end up as brothers? And I'm like, well, that's pretty obvious. Let's see, different last names. So both of us were born with the name Groverland as our last name. My mother's maiden name is Bigtree. on our Native American side of the family. And as he was going into theater and film and stage, he was kind of at the time reconnecting with his native roots and that heritage. He decided to go with her last name of Bigtree, her maiden name, which goes to our lineage of our grandfather and all that stuff. And so that's how that
Oh,
happened.
I see. So that was a decision of his as an adult, not it wasn't his last name as a kid.
Correct. Yeah, that was a decision of his as an
Got it.
adult.
Okay. Okay. That makes sense. I had somehow thought that your parents just allocated one surname to to each of you. But okay, that makes a little more sense.
It was an adult
Um,
decision, nothing forced upon him.
right. So I heard quite a bit about your unconventional childhood on that episode of the Highwire, but why
Hmm.
don't you tell us a little about what it was like growing up in the Unity Church where your dad was a minister?
I'd say I was quite lucky. It was quite an amazing experience. I think back on the youth program growing up in that church, and it's not necessarily your traditional idea of a church when you're thinking about it. It's very much into mind body awareness, self healing, you know, natural healing, all that sort of stuff. Diet, exercise, all a part of the theology. And so growing up in that church, being around other kids my age, having these conversations, thinking about these things is not as God is this entity outside you that is sort of judging you and damning you and that you're born out of sin, but that God is this, sort of universal intelligence moving in all through things. That was a really magical way to grow up. And it's a very empowering way to grow up. And, uh, and, and it's a way to grow up that you're learning tools on how to live this life and take care of yourself. So you become independent on your own divinity instead of sort of creating a dependence on an outside divinity or something you're expecting out there to take care of situations for you. So in that sense, it's very empowering and it's very uplifting. And the fact that I was born and raised into that, I didn't really have an awareness that there were other faiths, other traditions out there with a different ideology. I mean, I knew they were there, but I wasn't raised in it, so I didn't have that until an adult that I really realized how blessed I was to be raised the way I was.
That's so interesting. So tell me a little more about that concept of our divinity within and just channeling that and harnessing that as opposed to relying on, an outside deity.
Yeah, so I mean, the history of it comes from the founders of Unity are Myrtle and Charles Fillmore, and this is back in the late 1800s, around the 1890s. She has tuberculosis, and she's an adult, and her whole life she's been fairly sick. And she was a pretty staunch churchgoer, and the whole concept of God, the traditional concept of God, it just wasn't working for her. She was ill, and she was getting more ill, and she just thought there must be a different way to go about life than being sick. And she went to a seminar with her husband Charles, from Dr. E.B. Weeks. He was a New Thought person at the time, and New Thought was this kind of emerging idea of God and the universe and how to look at things, and not this entity outside ourselves, but this universal flow, this intelligence. And he said the affirmation, we'd call it, I'm a child of God. I do not inherit sickness or do not inherit disease. And so she started working with this concept, doing this affirmation over and over again for 2 years, and she was able to heal herself of tuberculosis just using her mind. So that's sort of the impetus for the entire Unity organization, this power to use your mind to heal your body, and that you're taking the power back into your body. So growing up, that was the fundamental belief we had in the family. If you're not feeling well about something, what did you do? What is your mind causing? What is this reaction happening in your life? What is a relationship you've started, or have you changed that you're eating something weird? And so our mind and how we were thinking and approaching things was a big part of our upbringing, that we'd have an awareness of how much the mind plays into the experience of this physical life.
Very interesting. Very interesting. So, when you were 12 years old, your dad gave a sermon that you describe as having a really profound impact on you. Why don't you talk a little about that particular day?
Yeah, so it was right around the time the book Diet for a New America came out. And I don't know if you heard of
That
that
is,
book, but that
I'll
was
just
sort of
interject. That is the single most mentioned book on this podcast. So many people were so deeply affected by that book, myself included. Yeah. So,
yeah. So there it was. It came out, and my father decided to do a talk on that and how that related to unity and how that was so in alignment with
ah,
unity. Because there's also a deep plant-based history in unity as well. And so he gave this talk on it, and at that point, we were kind of eating meat a little bit as a family. We weren't big on it. It would be white meat. It would be whatever it would be. But when I listened to that talk he gave about our interconnectedness with all life, not just human beings, but with animals, and that the treatment of animals actually matters, and what you eat matters, and what actually goes sort of the pain that goes into creating what winds up on your plate. If it's going to be meat, then that matters, and it really affected me. And at that point, I decided, I was going to be vegetarian from that point on, and just did. It wasn't like a family meeting. It wasn't a big, to do. It was just, this is what I'm going to do, and it aligned with our theology and the things we did. So the family was, pretty much on board. It wasn't a big issue for me. I know other people that was a huge issue in their family if they made that choice. So again, it's a blessing that I had this family. It was like, all right, great, you go for it. And many of them have been vegetarian or vegan at various times, and in that way as well. So that was sort of the big pinnacle moment for me to really be conscious about my integrity with my beliefs and the way I live my life, and starting to really analyze, and is the way I'm living aligning with what I believe to be true about life?
so you were thinking about all these deep issues when you were 12 years old.
Yeah, I don't want to think I was special, but it's just that we were exposed to different things probably at an earlier age. My parents were very, very big into the Edgar Cayce readings, which was sort of an individual that was tapping into this universal intelligence to heal people and to do this work in the modern age. So we were given those books growing up, to read those books, to understand about herbs and plant medicine and things that were around us. And my mom was, creating these herbs and plant medicine to heal us and work with us. So it wasn't like it was a really foreign concept to be thinking about these things. It was a part of our
Mm-hmm.
our upbringing. So once that came into my life, it was kind of the next natural progression to say, oh, well, my connection to the earth matters. My connection to animals matters. This is my next choice.
And what about your dad? Did he go vegetarian at that time as well after reading that book?
I would have to ask him. At 12, you don't really remember what everyone else is doing all that much. They've been mostly vegetarian most of their lives. Well, until they
Uh-huh.
came into unity, and they still are to this day, mostly vegetarian. And so I don't know what impact that had on him. Obviously, a big enough impact that he gave that talk on Sunday, and I'm sure he
Right,
got a
right.
lot of pushback and a lot of heat from congregants. And but I know a lot of people at the same time probably changed as well in the congregation. So yeah, I'd have to
But
ask him.
you don't remember like how the yeah, do you remember how the congregation responded to that sermon? And if he did get
No,
pushback at that time? No.
I know he would have, just because I know every time being a minister myself, you bring up something like that, which really is challenging a very widespread accepted social norm, you get pushback, and you have to go into it knowing you're likely going to lose some congregants, because if it's a really widely accepted social norm, you've hit a hot button. Even no matter how soft you try to peddle it or present it, it's kind of knowing that you're going to upset some people, and some people may even leave. And if it means that much to you that you feel like you're called to do it, then you kind of roll with it and go with the punches. So there's no doubt that that was going through his mind when he gave that talk and had that experience. But his ministry was thriving, and people were really there for his authenticity. Yeah,
Mm.
I've never really. It's funny. I've never thinking about being self-centered. I've never really thought about what was his experience with that process. You're like, oh, I'm thinking about my transformation. You're like, well, what was Dad going through? What was Mom going through?
Right, right. And it's interesting that there would be this pushback when, like you mentioned, unity does have roots in eating plant-based and eating vegetarian. In fact, didn't you mention that the founders were themselves vegan?
Yeah, so you look at the history. They started this organization. The organization's starting to take off. They're doing a lot of printing and publishing at that time to spread the word of what they're discovering, and they're calling unity. And they had a person who worked on their printing team that was a Seventh Day Adventist, and they are historically vegan or vegetarian by and large. And they invited him over for dinner one night. And this, as the story goes, they make dinner, they come out and they serve it, and it's a pot roast or something of that ilk. And he's just shocked because what he'd been reading coming from them and the theology they had been developing and these truth teachings they'd creating were all about respect and reverence for life and this oneness of life and everything else. And then when he watched that they're actually eating meat, he was shocked. From how you read about it, he kind of went off on them over that dinner, calling them out as hypocrites of how could you have these teachings and yet be, party to this system of suffering and constant torture and pain of these animals. And it was from that point forward where they had that aha moment. They made the connection because and you can't really try to judge people historically, look back on we should have been doing this and we should have been doing that. You look at when we make connections from things. So we all have these giant holes in our lives where we haven't quite made these connections between what we believe to be true and how we live our lives. And I continually catch myself going, you know what, if I believe that to be true, then I would be doing this. And it's a constant sort of correction down this path of what I believe to be true. So for them, it was one of those holy moments where they were called up by him to say, look, if you believe this to be true, then this wouldn't be what you're serving on your table. So they did go, at the time they called it vegetarian because we didn't have the word vegan till the 50s or so. And that probably would have been the early 1900s. And so they gave up meat and they studied more about the plant-based diet and fruits and vegetables. And Myrtle herself had a sort of a health coach in the Kansas City area that was helping her put together a plant-based diet to understand how it would work and move forward. And she kind of was bringing that into Charles's life. And so then it became very big for them. They didn't just switch their own diets. They made it a part of their publications. They made it a part of their printing. They made it a part of, they even created we'd call a vegan Bible, a first maybe Bible that wasn't bound in leather so that the people reading it wouldn't be party to it as well. And they talked a lot about it in their publications. And so it became a big thing. So then the next question could be, well, what happened? Right? I'm assuming that's the next question.
Exactly. Yes.
So and as you so often happens when you see parents handing off a business to their children didn't necessarily have the same beliefs that they did. They had 3 kids. Some of them did, some of them did not. And as they came into the different positions in unity, they sort of let it go by the wayside. I wasn't there. I can't speak specifically to it, but when you look through the archives and the history of it, it started to fade out. And there was some debate within unity as to, we can't let this go. This is what they were about. But it did start to fade out over time and kind of settled into the standard American diet and what we accept as the culture itself. So even in all transparency, Myrtle Fillmore died long before Charles Fillmore. He was over 10 years younger than she was. So he lived on after her. And just a few years before he passed, he actually went back to starting to eat fish because he felt he had some imbalance going on in his body. So it was sort of towards that time it started to tailor off because from my perspective, Myrtle really was the foundation of the organization. She was how it started with her healing. Charles was really the business side. He was more of the writer, the publicist. He grew it and made it into something that we know today. But she was kind of that heart that held it all together. And without her in his life, my theory is that he started to go a little bit back, even though his second wife was also very plant-based and thinking about diet and those sort of things.
Yeah.
But it just kind of faded out over time. So now here we are today. You look at some of the things they say in their publications. If you read them aloud today, people would be in shock and awe about how hardcore they were about
Mm,
They'd say eating flesh is what they're referring to, eating flesh.
right. And did you say he was 10 years younger than she was? That Charles was 10 years? Oh, wow. So very, very progressive in their relationship
She
dynamic.
she was way ahead of her time. I mean, you look at she became a teacher. She was, piloting an organization with her husband where she was seen as an equal. And we're talking about
Yeah.
1890, 1889. And she was out public speaking and she was doing these things. And it's funny to see some historical records of people actually writing to her and saying, you should not be on stage. Please go sit down. Your husband should be up there speaking, not you. And she's like, thank you for your opinion, but that's not how this works. And really to be blessed with a husband who lifted it up and celebrated her as well. She was always there with him, but she wasn't, as much of an orator as he was. So you wouldn't see her speaking as often but she was there doing the work behind the scenes and the prayer work and gathering the teams and training them how to eat and how to pray and how to meditate and live. And so she really was this amazing figure, way ahead of her time in a world that really embraced her because she was so authentic and so amazing that she moved on and excelled into these incredible things.
Wow. Yeah. Very inspiring to hear about a woman like that back then. So I'm just curious, in your experience, just knowing people within the Unity Church, were there a lot of people just, fellows that you knew that also were vegetarian and committed to that path?
Not necessarily. I mean, there are a group of people that are, and it's really not talked about. It's kind of something that's
Huh.
just been, I don't want to, how would you phrase it? I don't want to say shuffled on the rug, but it's just kind of been put in a box and put on the shelf over in the corner.
Mm,
So people
like
that,
compartmentalized a little bit, maybe.
right, and it's sort of like, okay, it's over there. We don't talk about it. If you're into it, you know where to find it, but this is not a big part of what we are today. So you have a lot of ministers and licensed unit teachers and congregants that when they read the old material, they have an awakening and they go, oh, okay, this is what unity is about. And that becomes unity for them. And so they change their diet and get in alignment with that. Other people that didn't resonate with that, didn't work for them, or they've come in later and haven't read the old material, whatever the case may be. So you have this, it's in really a small group in unity in terms of who's still sort of connected to that or resonates with that. We don't really have an exact number. It's hard to tell because, again, it's not talked about. It's not really put up front, except by a few unity ministers that are really passionate about it and that are out speaking about it and are trying to gather people around to say, we can still talk about this. We can still engage with this. It doesn't have to just be on the shelf.
Yeah, it sounds frustrating, honestly. It would be frustrating for me. In fact, recently I connected with an old college friend who now lives in Chicago, and she mentioned that she used to go to a Unity church there in Chicago. And I said, "Oh, did you know that the founders were vegan?" And she just her her face just went cold and she just had no interest. No interest. I mean, I couldn't have like pronounced a bigger turnoff to her.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you could have said, "Did you know the founders are from the moon?" And she's like, "Oh, okay, that's good."
Yeah, well, that would have been a little more palatable. I mean, yeah, yeah. So what was your path like, both professionally and with regard to your food and your eating? You continued as a committed vegetarian. Did you educate yourself, or was this just sort of something that you knew about yourself and didn't think too much about, but it was an integral part of your life?
It's interesting because it's something that kind of just sits on a shelf. So it wasn't necessarily taught to me in seminary. It wasn't really talked about. But as I'm reading the books and I'm doing the historical study I'm supposed to do, to have already been vegetarian and then reading about, oh, our founders were vegetarian, not just closet vegetarians. I mean, they were like, telling the world,
Advocates.
this is
Yeah.
advocates, this is the way to go. And not just advocates, but also starting the first vegetarian restaurant in Kansas City, quite likely. And that not only that, but having a Rolls Royce limousine that drives around Kansas City to pick up people to bring them to the restaurant to have lunch so that they can experience a vegetarian meal or what we call a vegan meal today. And then they created a cookbook, a Unity vegan cookbook, and it still sits around the archives and all these things. So they were so active in that. And then so coming through school and really reconnecting with that history was very exciting. It was very invigorating. But then you go out and start to do ministry and you realize it's this sort of taboo that we don't talk about. And even in my first ministry in Las Vegas, people know I'm plant-based, but it's not really something we talk about, because as soon as you talk about it, it's like, all right, you're kind of stepping out of your lane there. Let's get back into principle. Let's get back into what we do in Unity, and trying to, justify this. Well, that was even a bigger part of our organization than some of the things we talk about all the time. And there's more archival information on that than things that we talk about all the time today. And so we kind of
Like
turn a
what
blind
kind of
eye to,
things?
we talk about the, like we have a 5-step prayer practice, which is our specific way of going to prayer. But I think if you really went through our archives, they talked way more about vegetarianism and veganism than they talked about that specific prayer practice, and different areas of things we have where, we talk about this, but we're not going to talk about this. And I've always been a proponent of, and even they did not say, you have to eat this way. It was always about be educated on what you're doing, but let's have a conversation about you still need to decide what you do for your life. It's between you and God, but let's talk about it. That's been my passion today is, can we just talk about the box that's on the shelf? But you know how it goes. If you start to have a conversation about a plant-based diet, it's seen as an attack. And so we're in this system where now if we're just going to have a conversation about it, it's like, oh, well, you're telling me I have to eat this way. It's like, well, no. There's a big part of our history I think we should be talking about. Just know why they did it. Know how it came about. Know what it did for their life. And then decide for yourself. They had some very strong views on sex as well. And they spent a lot of time talking about the relationship of sex in your life. We also don't really talk about that today. And some of them are kind of wacky and far out there, but I don't think we should be trying to hide it. Let's talk about it. Why were they making these statements? Why did they believe this way? I see them as very spiritually evolved individuals. So I want to know what they were thinking, even if I think it's a little wackadoodle. Because for some reason, it came from somewhere in their spiritual path, or their experience, or a person they met that they thought it was important enough to talk about. Not only talk about, but start departments in their organization specifically for.
Right. So in your ministry in Las Vegas, which is a hilarious place to have a ministry, it seems like a lot of fun. I mean, also like your work may be cut out for you there. I mean, it seems like people there could probably really use some spirituality in their lives. But aside from all of that, how did your congregation, respond to just the mere fact that you were living a vegan life, and how much did you incorporate that into your ministry?
Well, in your first ministry, you're kind of trying to figure things out, and you're trying to get your feet wet, and you're trying not to bother people too much, and you're really trying to figure out, how do I stay employed? Because this is my job, and I have a board of directors that I have to answer to and keep them happy. And so one thing is that there's beautiful, amazing people in Las Vegas. And when we think about Las Vegas, we kind of think about the strip and the gambling, but really you have this giant city outside of that that's just like any other city in the world. It's got a lot of spiritual seekers and a lot of beautiful, wonderful people doing great things. So my congregants were these amazing people, and I missed them many, many times. I had so much fun with them. And they knew that I was, they were aware of it enough to make sure that I had something to eat if we're going to have a potluck. And they knew that if they were making something special for me, a dessert or something in a bring, that, it had to be plant-based and that sort of thing. So they were honoring and respectful of that, but it wasn't something that I was going to sort of push on them from the pulpit or talk about on Sunday. As people asked or they were struggling with something, I might bring it up and talk about the benefits I've had in my life. But it's, as a minister, it's always this fine line of how much can a congregation handle as I'm trying to push them to start thinking into new things. And is this my agenda, or is this what's best for all of us? And so you sit in this place of, all right, well, if I scare people away, that doesn't really do much, because then I'm just preaching to the choir. I'm just talking to the people that already get it. So I've got to slowly introduce concepts that fundamentally, if I get you to really understand unity principle, for me, I think that automatically starts opening you up to a plant-based diet. It starts to make you ask questions and think things that should take you in that direction towards a plant-based diet. That's my own personal perception as Shad Goverland. That is not agreed upon across Unity or anything like that. But for me personally, that is sort of the natural progression. You'll start to think about it, whether you choose to do it or not. At least you'll start to think about it. And then if you have questions, knowing that I already am eating a plant-based diet, you might come up and ask me, and that was things that would, happen now and then.
I mean, it makes sense to me in theory that unity and the concept of connection and compassion, that it would lead people in the direction of asking about food choices. But I don't know. I feel like a lot of times in real life, that gap doesn't necessarily end up getting bridged with a lot of people. Some people might might benefit from having that loop, connected for them.
Sure. And look, our founders didn't get it until someone called them out.
Yeah,
And
from
so,
another church, no less. Yeah,
right.
very interesting. Yeah.
And we had there's sometimes you tell ministers still tell stories amongst each other of things we thought were smart and weren't smart in hindsight, or we didn't really understand what we were getting into. But there was a movie called Unity, and I don't know if you knew about it. It came out probably
Mm-mm.
10 years ago, maybe somewhere around there. And so I looked at the trailer for this movie. And I'm like, there's this movie coming out called Unity. How cool. And I'm at Uni of Las Vegas as a minister. And so I go hop online, look at the trailer. I'm like, oh, this looks great. It looks like it's about the environment and all these wonderful things. And I knew it wasn't made by Unity. It was just a person that made a film, and they happened to
Mm-hmm.
call it Unity.
Yeah.
But it looked good. And so I announced to my congregation, I'm like, you know what? Why don't we do a field trip and go see this movie? It's a very small screening. It's only screening in Las Vegas. I think one night we could all go together and do this thing if you're up for it. And I gave this caveat. I said, look, I have not seen the movie. I've only seen the trailer. So I'm not exactly
Uh-oh.
sure what will unfold. And so people are like, oh, great, Reverend Shad. Yeah, let's go do a field trip. So we gather up and we head to this place. And we probably had maybe 12 people come with Erinna, my wife, to go see this movie. And then the movie opens, and it's basically a cow in the slaughter canal going in to be electrocuted before they drag it away for the whole thing, and it's just fighting to get out of its cage. And I mean, it's 5 minutes, so there's no cutaways, there's nothing else. It's just you're watching this cow fight and suffer to try to get out, because you can see the cows in front of it getting electrocuted and killed in this thing. And people brought their kids, and so it's just, I mean, and I am just, it's so hard to watch. I mean, I'm just being crushed, and I'm like, oh, this is a bit more heavy than I thought this might be, because that was not in the preview. And I mean, it just gets, I mean, the movie is just hard hitting from then on. It does not soften up. It just lays it on really thick, really deep. And so after the movie, we were supposed to get together and have a little discussion about the movie. And I apologize. Look, I had no idea it would be that graphic. I had no idea. Like, that was not shown in the preview, everything else. And I mean, you saw people walking out of the theaters, they're just like white and their eyes are bulging just in shock. Because if you're vegetarian, vegan, you've been exposed to this probably at some point in your life. You've done the research, you've kind of got seen behind the curtain of slaughterhouses. But a lot of people, it's just blinders, and they've never seen that. And this movie just pulled those blinders off in the most horrifying way. And so, surprisingly, no one was really upset at me that had happened, because I had given the disclaimer, I have not seen this movie. But coming out of that, probably 3 or 4 people said, I'm not going to eat meat again. It just, I can't, after I've seen what I've seen, I cannot do that. I cannot do that anymore. And I said, well, hey, that's your choice. I said, I did not bring you to this film to try to pressure anyone to stop eating meat. I said, I didn't even know it was really even about that, honestly. I thought it was just about unity of all life and sort of thing. But it was such an impact in the ministry that people would come back again and again and go, I cannot stop thinking about that film. I cannot stop thinking about how I have been living and how I should be living. And then asking my wife and I, do you guys have any recipes to help us get started with trying to become vegan? And is it people we can connect with? And so it created an impulse for a few people to say, I'm going to reanalyze my relationship to what I eat. And then other people just didn't really say much about it, but they didn't leave the church. They didn't create a hubbub, but just they go, all right, well, that wasn't for me. And they moved on. So, I mean, I would make little efforts here and there and try to expose people to stuff. But you do always walk that line of, I'm not trying to scare you out of ministry. I'm just trying to push a little bit to have you think. And I don't want to tell you how to think. I just want you to start questioning yourself. Are you in alignment with what you believe?
Right, right. I'm with you there. I mean, I keep the same frame of reference in mind when I talk to people about these subjects. Of course, the thing that makes it trickier to be patient with another person's process and timeline is, of course, the fact that meanwhile there are all these animals, suffering, and they don't have time to be patient. They don't have time for people to just come to their own conclusions and consider their values in this leisurely fashion and just casually decide whether or not, their values call for them to, forego a particular item on their plate. So that's of course the thing that makes it trickier for me. But when was it specifically that you made the leap from general vegetarian to fully vegan?
Yeah, as I was studying to become a unity minister, and I was starting to speak on Sunday, and really once I decided I was going to be a uni minister, really sort of when I took my first class, I'm like, okay, I'm gonna do this. I wanted to commit to myself to not be a hypocrite, and that if I'm going to be talking about these principles to other people, I really want to be living them to the best of my ability and taking my own life to task and challenging my own thinking so that I don't ever stand up there on a Sunday or when I'm giving a class and tell you something I have not applied to my own life, or at least that I'm currently applying and working on. Because and I would say if you catch me walking on a Tuesday afternoon and I don't know you see me, I want you to go, yeah, he is actually still living what he talked about on Sunday. He's not perfect,
Right, even
right?
when no one's watching him.
Right.
Yeah.
Even though, but if you catch me stubbing my toe, a little something might slip out of my mouth, but I'll still, rein myself back in. You're still human. But to just see, like, all right, if these principles work, I have to live them because it's more about who I am as an authentic being showing up to show that this stuff works rather than me saying it. So at that point in time, I really dedicated to a daily meditation and spiritual practice. It's like I can't be just kind of doing it haphazardly or I get to it 3 or 4 times a week. It's going to have to be every single day I commit to this practice if I'm going to see the benefits of it and talk about the benefits of that to other people. And so back to your question, I mean, at that time, I was already starting to wean myself off of eggs and dairy, not necessarily even consciously. It just stopped tasting good to me. Eggs just started tasting like sulfur. They didn't really taste desirable, whether that was made in an omelet or however it was presented. And then milk always kind of felt a little off to me. It always made me stuffed up basically my entire life. So I was kind of just naturally weaning myself off of cow's milk for that very same reason. And then I met my wife, Erinna, and she was vegan already. And that's kind of how we found each other on an online dating site and trying to figure out what do I really resonate with. And I looked for the only vegan or vegetarian on the site in Las Vegas, and it was her. And so when I met her, she started just sort of questioning me. She's like, why are you still eating eggs? Why are you still drinking milks? Why are you still using cheese and that and the other thing? I didn't really have a good answer. And she's a phenomenal cook. So she would make something and say, I'm like, well, that's delicious. I guess I don't need cheese in that dish. And I guess I didn't need eggs, and I guess I didn't need milk. And to really see that there was another way to really, cut the rest of that out of my life. And my daughter was, eating with us and doing that with us too. And it's just sort of, it doesn't become a big thing. It's just, we're going to eat good, delicious food that feels right to us and is in alignment with the way we believe. And then it's not a big, oh my goodness, you're taking something away. How could you take that from me? It's really, I'm going to make this choice because it feels right to me at this time in my life in what I believe. So she was a really big impetus to push me over that last little bit. And I would say things like, oh, but you got the happy chickens and they're running around. Eggs aren't really that big a deal. And she'd go, do you want to watch some videos? And I go, no, I don't want to watch some videos. I already know exactly what I'm going to see. And she talked to me about, the free range chicken label. It doesn't really mean much of anything. And so it didn't take much because I was already in that place where I'm taking my life to task. I want to be living in authenticity with my beliefs. And so I go, you're right, and just sort of move through that process with her. And she's making such amazing food. It really wasn't that hard.
I have to say, I mean, there's almost always a woman somewhere in the picture when there's a vegan man and you talk to him about his story. I mean, so many times
yeah. Well, and you think about such a big part of it is who's cooking the meals and who's better at it.
It's true.
And she was a way better cook than I was, and it just made more sense.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. I remember hearing a speaker at Vegan Summerfest a few years ago just talking about how so many people hear about the vegan lifestyle and say, oh, I could never do that. I could never live just on vegan food. And she would describe how she would say to them, well, have you ever in your life had a vegan meal that you enjoyed, that was satisfying and that you felt good afterwards? Well, yeah, I've had a vegan meal. She's like, well, you can do that every time. like there's no reason that can't be replicated at every meal.
Right. Yeah, I enjoyed someone.
Yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I think it was at the vegan retreat here on property, maybe the first one I went to at Unity Village, and someone had mentioned, people always say, well, I could probably be vegan except for the cheese. And the presenter said, okay, then be vegan except for the cheese.
Right.
Like,
Well, I heard a speaker. Yeah. A speaker I heard
where your mouth is.
Exactly. Yeah. I heard someone say once, just because you can't do everything or you don't want to do everything, don't do nothing.
Right.
Do everything but the thing, the cheese or whatever it is.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But it's also back on. Go ahead.
No, please.
Well, I was just going to say, it's also back on the, vegan and vegetarian community where there is this subculture of, if you're not 100% vegan, full on, I wouldn't even, look at a bee sideways, then you're not doing it. And it's, you're a failure. And there is that energy out there that it's like, you're either all or nothing. Meatless Mondays is not enough. You've got to go all in. And you realize people are just like, well, can I just try a little bit? Can I ease my way into it? And really, that's a healthier way, I believe, of going about it. Is people that try to do this hard stop tend to just fall out of it. It's like trying to quit smoking. And it's taken me a while to really realize, that meat is addictive. It's not just a choice. It's actually a form of addiction that, it's through repetition. Anything we do through repetition becomes a form of addiction. And anything that's addictive that you try to just stop is going to be coming back. It's just, that's not, it's not really the way it works, but weaning something off over time is how you get through addiction, and having a support system of people around you that aren't shaming you for not doing good enough, but saying, yeah, whatever you can do, great, you're doing awesome. Keep up with it. I'll share some recipes with you. I'll even bring over some food for you to try. That's where the successful model, works, not in the shaming, you're not doing it right, you got to be full vegan.
Right. I mean, that all makes so much sense. And at the same time, once you kind of put those pieces together from an ethical perspective in your head, it's hard to know, just like we wouldn't we wouldn't expect or think it was okay for someone to be racist just one day a week or a few days a week or just here and there. A couple of racist
Mm-hmm.
jokes, is okay. So with speciesism and veganism, it's, especially if you're coming at it from an ethical perspective, it does start to feel like it is all or nothing, at least philosophically. But at the same time, you're absolutely right. I mean, people have their process, and shame and guilt don't get anyone anywhere. And not to mention, I just always bring it back to myself and my own experience. I was in my 40s when I went vegan. So I'm
Mm-hmm.
no one to talk, I'm no one to talk. And more than anything, I feel lucky that I found this path. And by the way, how is your health throughout all of this? Did it change when you went fully vegan, or had you already been close enough that you didn't really feel that much of a shift?
No, I mean, really going fully vegan, I had uh, fairly bad seasonal allergies most of my life growing up in Colorado, and the pollen would start. In Las Vegas, you've got all sorts of weird plants that have been transplanted there that aren't supposed to be there. So they'd be blooming at
Huh.
weird times, and I'd be stuffed up, and I couldn't even hardly speak on Sunday. And that pretty much melted away when I got rid of the dairy and the cheese, just completely went from vegetarian to vegan. And I didn't necessarily have that afternoon crash where you get so tired. And Erinna also inspired me to give up gluten because that was also a part of that process. And just realizing how much that was affecting me in a way that I just had accepted. And I'm not a person who takes medication, so I was all in with whatever my body was doing. I wasn't taking anti-congestants. I'm like, if I'm congested, I guess I'm supposed to be congested, and that's kind of how I lived. But yeah, just watching the shift of the energy, easier to sleep, easier to wake up, not having that stuffy nose so often throughout the year, or the runny nose, or that sort of thing. And I still will sneeze as the wind blows and things are coming through, but my body seems to adjust to whatever is happening instead of just going into complete freak out mode.
Well, that makes sense. So how would you say you've evolved as a vegan? How long has it been now that you've been, fully vegan?
2012, I think, was probably when I went full vegan, with the
Okay.
entrance of Erinna in my life. Yeah, I mean, those charts out there. I think a couple different people talk about the cycle of a vegan. And you talk about you're coming in as a militant vegan, and you just want to tell everyone that they're wrong and they're killing, they're murderers, and all this sort of thing. And then you kind of gas out on that effort because you realize it might have been doing more harm than good, and you cycle back around, you settle into this, all right, well, I'm doing the best I can for my life. I'm happy to talk to people about it, but I'm not going to go out and scream at people all the time about how horrible they are. And that you try to find this balance of my life is my message. I'm going to help the cause, but somewhere in there, either you're going to be very much of an activist, or you're going to kind of say, I've made this decision for myself. I'm not really concerned about what other people are doing, and you're going to find somewhere on the spectrum that's where you lie. So for me personally, I would come at people very strong, with the idea of if you, you know, if this was a child on your plate, would you eat this, and this and different statements, and realizing that was pushing people away, not just from me, but even the consideration of the conversation, and to really come at it from sort of the same way I've addressed talking to people about racism and unconscious bias and the things that I've worked on in my life. Is my life's just been better because of it. Because ultimately we think about, well, what's in it for me? We have a lot of empathy, but we are trained through childhood and adulthood to shut down and sort of crush our empathy for the things around us, because we believe that if we have too much empathy, then we're not going to be able to function in society. So don't worry about that. Don't worry about that. Don't worry about that. But as you get in the spiritual path and you're evolving, you're kind of opening up that capacity for empathy again. And I like to talk about how amazing that has been for me. Not so much about, it's the planet, it's the torture to the animals, because in ways we've shut down the empathy to really care about that. We've been desensitized to it. We've been over inundated with it. So talk about like, look, I've done this and it's made my life better. I feel better about myself. I feel better about my relationship to the animals around me. I feel better about the planet. I feel better about all these things. And it's worked for me really well. And I don't get to say what you're going to do for your life. I'm not going to tell you what you're going to do for your life. I don't know your body. I don't know your ethics. I don't know what you believe. I can tell you what's worked for me, and it's worked really well. And it's worked for some other people I know also. And yeah, I mean, internally, you can really get riled up with, well, the animals don't get to have that conversations, and the animals don't get to sort of sit back and wait for things to get better. But all major shifts in our society took a lot of time. And you had the early adopters who said, I don't care how uncomfortable this gets, I'm going in to do something about this. And then you had sort of the next phase of people that heard the early adopters and got on board with that. But you have this big bell curve of sort of the big group of people that are like, meh, if that's the way the world goes, I'll kind of go along with that. And then you have the back end of the bell curve. They're never going to be on board no matter what you do. And so that's why we still have racism today. There's just this back end of people that it doesn't really matter what happens. There's a group in the middle that I'm not sure I really think this is a thing. And your early adopters are the amazing people that are pushing these big movements to happen. So unfortunately, they've always taken time, from child labor laws to women's rights to the people of color for gay marriage, of all these different things. They've taken a lot of time, and you always have your early adopters that push a cause in front of the general public to see. And then slowly the general public starts to see, yeah, okay, that makes sense. And then there's a group of people that are going to fight it no matter what and probably never get on board. And so I think we're at a stage where the general public is starting to get exposed to it. And we're seeing plant-based meats in Walmart and Target and all these places where, for me, that's an amazing accomplishment it's gotten that far. And so we could celebrate the wins. And, we're still working as best we can, but celebrate those wins that, we're at least talking about it and we're thinking about it on a national and international scale. And that's an amazing thing.
Yeah, that's a really, really great way to look at it and just reframe just what we're dealing with here as vegans in a not yet vegan world. And I do always try to remind myself and friends too, when they get frustrated about these issues, like, we are the early adopters in many ways. We're not as early as some people. And in my own individual life, going vegan in my 40s, I don't consider myself having gotten there early in my life, but we're vegans in a world that hasn't gotten there yet. And so to me, that's like a real privilege and a source of gratitude and, a blessing. And it also has its challenges and its responsibilities. And that's just it. I'd rather have that awareness than not have that awareness. So I'm not going to complain about the challenges that come along with that consciousness. Do you feel like your role, in your ministry and just as a leader within Unity Church has given you maybe some enhanced influence, among your congregation? Do you feel like people look at this person who's officially, an authority figure of some sort? Do you feel like that's given any weight to your message, or are people no more likely to listen to you about veganism than about, than anybody else?
I don't know that it has. I mean, I would give myself any real credit or that there's any sort of reverence for that. I don't.
Maybe even less, because people say,
less.
The saintly people do that, but the regular people don't have to do
It's unattainable. He spends so much time meditating.
Right.
He's not even a normal human being or something. But yeah, I don't know. But one thing I have been really thinking about lately is, if we look at hindsight, I would want to say for myself that when we were working on the issues of child labor, and being children be only built children instead of being working in coal mines. I would hope I was on the early adopter front end of that. And we look at, women's rights and the right to vote and all the different things that you're fighting for. I would hope I was on the front end of that. And we look at slavery and we look at equal rights for people of color in the United States. I would also hope I was on the front end of that. And we look at gay rights and the things that actually happened during my lifetime, and I was pushing for that. I probably could have been more on the front end of that. But we have the opportunity now to look back and say, I likely would have missed some of those because I'm a regular human being and not everyone was on board at that time. And great people were missing the boat as it was leaving the port, if you want to put it that way. And there were people fighting every one of these issues, not evil, crazy, dark people, regular people saying, no, it's good business to keep these kids in the factory. It's good for the family to make the money. It's good for the corporation to make money. It's productive. It's good for the country. There's people fighting that cause, and they had good arguments from their perspective to be the case. And every one of these huge issues we see, there's regular people on the side where we would now go, I would have never been on that side. But we do find ourselves there. So really the opportunity today is you're now in the middle of the next one, right? The next thing that most assuredly in the future, we're going to look back and go, some people were early adopters of this concept of animal rights and animal cruelty. And then some people were really late to get on board, and some people fought it the whole time. Where do I want to be in that? I actually have a choice to be a part of history right now of where I'm going to fall in that line. I didn't get to choose on a lot of these things. Some people were alive long enough that they did get to choose. But this is mine for this generation. Where do I want to be in that time of history, pushing the next huge shift in consciousness on this planet? I think that's a good discussion to have with people, because we're not talking about even animal cruelty. We're not talking about how it affects your body. We're just talking about culturally, when we're part of big shifts, where do you want to be when that happens?
That's beautiful. Yeah, I totally am with you in that framing of it all. It's really interesting. What is it you think that holds people back from, just more awareness around these issues and their ability to absorb it? Because I mean, like you've alluded to, we've all got our blind spots. Even people who are brilliant and really aware and compassionate in a zillion different areas can have a blind spot about animal ag or just some other issue. And I've had my own blind spots. What do you think it is? And do you think there's an accelerated way to kind of open that awareness?
One, I think how we frame the message really has a lot of impact. And for me, if I can't go into a conversation assuming I might be wrong, then there's no reason the other person should even listen to me. Because if there's no chance they might be right, then why are we having this conversation? It's basically just a lecture where I'm just talking at you and I'm assumed everything I've said is right. I have to come in with some humility that I really don't know everything. And really, that we had a great conversation when we were at that event together. I don't know if you were sitting right there, but we talked about, look, honestly, we drive by cow pastures, we drive by cattle farms, we drive by these things. We don't scream and pull over and tear down the rails and start pulling cattle out like as if we saw a real mother and her child about to be separated and sent into a slaughterhouse or attached to a milking machine. We don't do that. And that is kind of hypocritical. Because if it was a human being, we probably would go tear down a fence and just, do what we needed to do to save those people. So even we do follow sort of these socialized concepts that would just be not okay. And some people really do that. So there are people that do that. So even in a sense, I'm a hypocrite that I say, I see animals as equals, but if I saw a mother and child on the side of the road about to be put into a slaughterhouse, I'm pulling over and I'm doing something about it. So even I have a disconnect still to work on, to develop, to figure out how do we function in this world. So I think that's where conversation happens, is me coming in to say, I don't know that I'm totally right. And I have an opportunity to think that you might be bringing something to the table that I didn't know, and that also could be right. But every time we come into a conversation with, I'm going to tell you how you're wrong, then I don't think we've gotten anywhere. It's, tell me what you believe. Tell me what you think about this. I'll tell you what I believe, what I think about this. And I'll just tell you, I'm hyper concerned about not being a hypocrite and being, that's just me. I'm crazy about that. I'm constantly thinking about, if I believe that to be true, I got to do something about it. And having that conversation, just be like, but I want to know about you. I want to know about your beliefs. I want to know where you come from. And let's both question our own beliefs. Then we're having a dialogue. But talking at people, I don't know if it accomplishes much.
Yeah, again, I'm sure you're right. And everything you say makes so much sense. And at the same time, for me personally, it's a lot harder to put into practice, especially around this issue, especially when it comes to the health aspects of it. And, because I really do think we're right in this being the optimal diet. But at the same time, I mean, you're absolutely correct that even if we're right, on the facts, at least a lot of the facts that we can know, people have different priorities, people have different values and different preferences, and just different ways of structuring their life. I mean, when I went vegan, it was very reluctantly. Quite
Mm.
honestly, I was a non-vegan vegetarian, eating lots of healthy dairy, non-fat Greek yogurt, egg whites, and as a little more information started to creep in, first about the egg industry and then later about dairy, it just became this niggling feeling at my conscience. And I didn't want to go vegan. I really didn't want to go vegan, but kind of like you were describing, I know myself. I know I can't live with that niggling feeling at my conscience forever. Other people seem to be better able to do that and kind of shut that off. But
Mm-hmm.
I knew myself, so I thought, well, I'm going to have to do it eventually, so may as well just do it now. And it, of course, turned out to be one of the most, if not the most, significant and positive decisions of my life. But yeah, you're right. I mean, and what I try to keep in mind too is just, as much as we can enjoy the process of talking to these people who have the different viewpoints, that's for me really where it's at, because that's the work. It's fun to talk to people like you and people who have seen the light, and where we can just, validate each other and empathize with each other and affirm one another and congratulate each other on how smart we are and how ahead of the curve we are. But that's not the work. The work, if we're going to move the needle in a positive way, the work is to talk to the people who don't share those beliefs right now.
And
Do
to
you find a
really
way to
empathize.
enjoy those? Yeah, yeah. So would you say you enjoy these conversations, or you really bring yourself into that place of humility and trying not to be too hard nosed or adamant?
Yeah, I mean, I've been humbled enough times in my life and humiliated enough times in my life where I thought I knew something and someone else knew way more than I did, or I did something wrong because I was being closed-minded and egotistical, thinking I got this, and I blew it up and
Yeah,
had to look like a greenhorn, a greenie, in some industry or something. Enough times that I have to believe someone else knows more than me. It's
right,
always a
right,
possibility. As much as I think I know an
right.
issue and I study things inside and out, I've it just come to a place where I've got to accept that whoever I'm about to talk to might actually be more right than I am on the issue. That's just the way it's always been. Because there's just so many times where I've had the opportunity to stick my own foot in my mouth. I really don't want to do that anymore. So I always try to come in and just say, this is my perspective on the issue, and this is how it's worked for me. But I find it fascinating to hear how someone else's mind works. You know,
Mm-hmm.
how have uh, how do you rationalize eating meat? How do you deal with that? How do you work with that? because I'm not saying it's wrong. I want to hear for you how that's worked out for you, because for me, it came to a place where it was wrong for me. So I'm just curious, has it ever crossed your mind? Because it crossed my mind, and all of a sudden I went down this rabbit hole. Maybe it hasn't crossed your mind, or it has crossed your mind, and you've closed it, and you're fine with it. And I'm always just curious about your thought process, how you got
Right.
somewhere, if you are thinking
Right.
about it. And that's where I'm more excited about what you believe and how you came to what you believe than trying to show that it might be wrong or right. Just the questioning process, I think, is really the most important thing. It's like, no matter how sure you are about something, I love to hear that you're still questioning it. That just brings comfort to me. Because as soon as someone says they're right and they start talking with just place of, I'm done, I don't have to research anymore, I know this is the way it is, and that is always concerning to me, because that's what's always led to a lot of suffering on this planet, is someone who thought they were so right they couldn't be wrong. But just anyone says, it's the
Right.
way I feel.
Yeah, that's a great point, and it also just strikes me in hearing you just point that out, how boring it would be if we just reached this place where there's nothing left to learn about a particular subject. How boring and how unexciting that would be. And to think that, oh, there's a curiosity has to be finite, because we reach a point where we understand everything, and therefore there's nothing to learn or discover. So yeah, that's helpful just to me to hear you frame it in that way. All right. Well, I've got just a couple more questions for you
All right.
before we wrap up. But one question I would like to ask is about Jesus. Unity is, of course, a Christian church. And when you were coming up in the church and thinking about Jesus, did it ever cross your mind to wonder about how Jesus ate? And do you have any opinions on that matter?
Yeah, so coming up through unity in our relationship to Jesus is very different how other people might have a relationship with Jesus, in that we see Jesus as a regular human being who did the spiritual work to reach the spiritual place that he attained by doing that work, and that he wasn't gifted these magical powers at birth and the only Son of God that was just born as a deity, but here was this beautiful soul that did the work, did the prayer, did the meditation, did the processing, and arrived at a place where, heck, he could walk on water, he could raise the dead. He had that spiritual place in his life.
Okay, so like a Buddha,
More like
he
a
was.
Buddha, yeah.
Yeah.
In that,
Okay. I
Jesus is our brother, our role model that any of us could then attain, doing that same work, doing that same process, arriving to that same level of consciousness, which we call Christ consciousness. His last name wasn't Christ. It was sort of a descriptor of what he had become, Jesus the Christ. And each one of us has that Christ awareness. So what is his diet? It's such a fascinating, I have thought about that. And we so often, refer to Jesus as the Prince of Peace, and we've got the image of the Lamb hanging over his shoulders, and then you go, well, how could that Prince of Peace and this beautiful entity of love and oneness then be a party to harming another creature, another person, another animal? And so, heck, I don't get to speak for Jesus, that's for sure, and to really know what was going on at the time. But there's a lot of fascinating work being done in that area right now to really talk about, do we have the correct translations of the Bible when it talks about the loaves and fishes, and were they really fishes, or was this really a marmalade when we translate it, or a spread that went with the bread? It wasn't fish at all, and the different things. We're starting to have those conversations, and I think that's phenomenal, because I believe in a Jesus of just this beautiful eternal love for all things, for all creatures, for all beings, for all people of all walks of life. And for me, that translates to how we eat. And if Jesus, reaching this really high point of spiritual attainment, would have made that conscious connection. And we know that he was not big on the slaughter and the sort of the Old Testament way of bringing about sacrifice and doing that sort of things. He was trying to move us beyond that, and really, so the next natural progression would be like, well, let's talk about how we eat and how we farm and how we raise cattle and how we do these things. So I don't know. I think that we're going to learn a lot about that. And I think that as we're starting to talk about that, and you have the movies like Christspiracy coming out to really, pose the question. It'll be a while before we really can have a calm conversation about it. Because if you want to really get someone fired up, bring up Jesus and veganism, and away you go. It's two hot topics together. You might as well throw politics at it while you're in there.
Perfect, right? Politics
Perfect
is
storm.
the seasoning, the cayenne pepper in the dish. All right. Well, Shad, so what's next for you? Personally, professionally, like what's your vision for, this next chapter?
It's a super fascinating question. I really don't know. I'm sitting in the question right now, and I'm at a place where I could take another church and minister again. I could start looking at an online ministry. I could go in a different field of work. I could join a different nonprofit. I could consult ministries. I could try to build an organization that supports vegan ministers. I could do almost anything at this point. And I'm really just in prayer meditation, waiting for what Spirit has for me next. I know that in the position I had with Unity Worldwide Ministries as the CEO, I was there for a very specific reason, and Spirit put me there and led me there, and I was there. And that season came to an end, just like all seasons cycle through. And so here I am now, and I'll just follow that process and see where it's supposed to go. I want to do something that's impactful. I want to really feel like I'm making a difference, and it doesn't have to be for thousands of people. I really like to see people transform and have aha moments. And so that's whatever it is, I want to be a part of people having aha moments.
Very nice. Very nice. Well, we wish you the best. I'm confident that, you will receive that guidance because you're clearly living a life that makes you available for that guidance and for that input from the universe, spirit, whatever word works best for people. Final question, which I like to ask all my guests. Is there a particular word that for you sums up what being vegan is all about?
For me personally, I'll say it's integrity, because in my life, it's just, I've had to have integrity with what I believe, and that just aligns with what I believe.
Yep. Yep. That makes complete sense to me. And that's one of my big words as well. Yeah. Well, thank you, Shad. Thank you so much for joining us today and for your good work and your integrity out there in the real world where it can be lacking at times. But really appreciate your time. It's been great meeting you and chatting with you. And thanks for joining us today.
Well, thanks for having me on. I appreciate the invite.
Oh, yeah. My pleasure. And we close every episode by taking 30 seconds of silence for all of the suffering animals, human and non-human, who desire, as we all do, safety, happiness, and the freedom to live out their lives without interference. So, Shad, I invite you to join me in 30 seconds of silence for the animals, and we'll conclude with the sound of the bell. Thank you, Shad, and thank you, Posse. See you next time. Until then, stay strong and stay true.